Yeah, welcome again to episode 7, which is chapter 6 of the book Faith, Power, and Emancipation. I am the author and your host, Professor Januarius Asongu, and thank you for joining me once again as we continue our journey through my book, Faith, Power, and Emancipation. In our last episode, we explored chapter 5. Where we considered the limits of liberation. We discovered that overtrain operation is only the beginning. History teaches us that revolutions often succeed in removing unjust rulers but fail to establish lasting freedom. Genuine liberation requires accountable institutions, moral discipline, epistemic humility, and a commitment to truth. Today, we conclude part 2, Empire and the Crisis of Power, with a chapter entitled False Peace, Ideology, and Prophetic Disruption. This chapter begins with a simple but profoundly important question. What if what we call peace is not really peace? Most people instinctively think of peace as the absence of conflict. If there is no war, if the streets are quiet, if governments appear stable, if people seem to be getting along, then surely we have peace. But the biblical tradition asks a far more difficult question. Peace for whom? A society may appear peaceful while millions live in fear. A nation may appear stable while injustice quietly destroys lives every day. An economy may flourish while entire communities remain trapped in poverty. A government may proclaim unity while systematically silencing those who dare to speak uncomfortable truths. That is not genuine peace. It is what I call false peace. Peace, false peace, is the appearance of harmony without the presence of justice. It is stability purchased at the expense of truth. It is order maintained by ignoring suffering. Throughout history, oppressive systems have often survived precisely because they convinced people that disturbing the existing order was more dangerous than confronting injustice itself. In other words, people were taught to fear conflict more than they feared oppression. The prophets of the Old Testament understood this danger remarkably well. When we read Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Micah, or Ezekiel, we discover something fascinating. The prophets were rarely popular. Why? Because they refused to accept the official story. Kings declared that the nation was secure. The prophets warned that injustice was destroying it from within. Religious leaders proclaimed that God was pleased. The prophets insisted that worship without justice was empty ritual. Political authorities celebrated prosperity. The prophets pointed to widows, orphans, strangers, and the poor and asked a simple question. If society is flourishing, why are these people suffering? That question remains just as relevant today. One of the central arguments of this chapter is that ideology often becomes the greatest enemy of justice. When many people hear the word ideology, they often think only of political parties. But ideology is much broader than politics. An ideology is any system of ideas that becomes so powerful that it prevents us from seeing reality honestly. Every society develops narratives about itself. Some of these narratives are true, Others are myths that protect existing power. An ideology tells us everything is fine when reality says otherwise. It tells us inequality is normal. It tells us corruption is inevitable. It tells us things have always been this way. Eventually, people stop asking questions. They stop imagining alternatives. False peace becomes normal. This is why I connect ideology with what I have elsewhere called epistemic fracture. When our understanding of reality becomes distorted, our moral judgment becomes distorted. If suffering is hidden, justice loses its agency. If oppression is renamed as stability, resistance begins to look irresponsible. If lies are repeated often enough, truth itself begins to appear controversial. This is why I argue through my philosophical work that liberation always begins with recovering the capacity to perceive reality truthfully. Truth is not merely an intellectual exercise, truth is a moral responsibility. It brings us to one of the most important ideas of this chapter: prophetic vocation. What is a prophet? Many people imagine prophets as individuals predicting the future. The Bible presents something far richer. The prophet is someone who tells the truth when society has become comfortable with illusion. The prophet refuses to allow injustice to become normal. The prophet reminds society of realities it prefers to forget. That is why I greatly admire Walter Brueggemann's description of the prophetic imagination and Johann Baptist Mann's idea of dangerous memory. Communities that remember suffering cannot easily justify systems that continue producing it. Memory itself becomes an act of resistance. This is exactly what the biblical prophets did. They restored memory. They reminded Israel of the covenant. They reminded kings of justice. They reminded the wealthy that prosperity purchased through exploitation is not a blessing, but a judgment upon society. The prophet interrupts false peace. Notice something else. Prophets are almost never welcomed by those in power. Jeremiah was imprisoned. John the Baptist was executed. The Old Testament prophets were mocked, rejected, and persecuted. Jesus himself was crucified. Why? Because truth threatens systems built upon illusion. This pattern has repeated itself throughout history. Dietrich Bonhoeffer challenged Nazi Germany when many preferred silence. Martin Luther King Jr. confronted segregation while being accused of disturbing public order. Archbishop Desmond Tutu insisted that South Africa could never build lasting peace without first telling the truth about apartheid. In every generation, prophetic voices are criticized for creating division. Yet, perhaps they are not creating division at all. Perhaps they are simply revealing divisions that already existed but had been carefully hidden beneath the appearance of peace. That is why I make an important distinction in this chapter. The prophet is not primarily a destroyer. The prophet is a restorer. He restores the relationship between truth and reality. He enables society to see itself honestly again. From the perspective of critical synthetic realism, this is exactly what truth requires. Reality exists independently of our narratives. When ideology separates public perception from reality, moral judgment becomes impossible. Prophetic speech reconnects society with reality. It makes suffering visible again. It exposes injustice. It restores possibility. It restores possibility of genuine moral responsibility. But this chapter does not stop with critique. It asks a constructive question. How should Christians respond? Should we simply condemn society? No, that would be too easy. This is where liberative realism offers a different path. Liberative realism insists that prophetic witness must always be accompanied by institutional imagination. It is not enough to expose injustice. We must also help build alternatives. We must strengthen schools that teach truth, churches that remain independent, universities committed to honest inquiry, courts committed to justice, communities capable of dialogue, families that cultivate virtue, civil society organizations that hold power accountable. Prophetic courage without institutional reconstruction eventually exhausts itself. Institution building without prophetic courage eventually becomes complacent. We need both. This balance also requires humility. No prophet possesses perfect knowledge. No theologian possesses perfect knowledge or complete wisdom. No political movement has all the answers. Because our knowledge remains partial, our commitment to truth must always include openness to correction. That is not weakness, it is intellectual integrity. It is precisely this combination of conviction and humility that distinguishes liberative realism from ideological certainty. As we conclude part two of this book, I hope one message remains with you. Peace is not merely the absence of conflict. True peace is the presence of justice, and justice cannot flourish where truth is suppressed. The church therefore has a permanent vocation, not to become an arm of of a political party, not to baptize ideologies of the left or the right, but to remain a prophetic community that continually recalls society to truth, dignity, justice, and hope. Only then can peace become more than a political slogan. Only then can people become a moral reality. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Faith, Power, and Emancipation. In our next episode, we begin part three, the ethics of liberative resistance, where the conversation moves from understanding power to exploring the moral responsibilities of those who resist it. If you found today's discussion meaningful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and leave a comment below. Your support helps these conversations reach people around the world. And if you would like to explore these ideas more deeply, I invite you to purchase Faith, Power, and Emancipation on Amazon or directly from my website, asongubooks.com, where you will also find my latest books, articles, podcasts, and other scholarly resources. Until next time, may God bless you, strengthen your commitment to truth, and grant you the wisdom to become an instrument of justice and authentic peace. Thanks.